By now you may have seen my How to Make a Language series. The information presented in those videos represents what took me years to learn through pure trial and error, and it was intended to give any beginners a head start by outlining all the steps to take when creating a naturalistic conlang. However, just as important as discussing the things you should do when making a conlang is detailing what you shouldn't do when making a conlang, as there are a number of common perils that beginning conlangers might fall victim to. And what better way to teach you how to avoid these than to let you learn from my mistakes. Today, we're going to have a look at Thandian, the first conlang I ever made. And, I'm not gonna lie, this is going to hurt. This thing has been collecting dust on my hard drive for years now, and to this day I still can't stand to look at it. But now I'm finally going to put aside my shame and look back through this ill-begotten mess in the hopes that anyone watching this may avoid suffering the same fate that I did. And before Conlang Critic can somehow get his hands on it. But before we get to the language itself, let's start with a little stalling. I mean, background. I first had the idea to make my own language about 6 years ago. I was reading The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, and the thing that caught my attention most of all was the portrayal and application of the Elvish languages, which were featured pervasively throughout the text. I had already known that Tolkien had created his own languages for his legendarium, but this was the first evidence I had that there was actual structure behind it. It clearly wasn't random gibberish. There was very apparent systematicity to it, and it reinforced the feeling that Middle-earth had an intricately fleshed out history and background of which the reader was being exposed to only a small fraction. And so I thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool if I could do something similar? At the time, I had a world-building project I was working on for an RPG group I was involved with, and I thought I'd try my hand at creating a language for that setting to pull off a similar effect. Now, by this point, the only language that I understood the grammar of on a technical level was Latin, since I'd studied it in high school and tried to teach it to myself for a few years afterward. And so when it came to my own language, I kept all the grammar of Latin intact and just changed the phonological forms of the roots and affixes, producing a one-to-one relex of Latin. The only aspect of grammar that I changed was reducing Latin's 5 declensions and 4 verb conjugations down to exactly 1 noun declension and 1 verb conjugation. Because why would I possibly want more than 1? That would just be confusing. And so I happily went along coining new words as I needed them and working with the grammar that I was already familiar with. But that all changed when I went to Turkey for the first time in 2013. It suddenly struck me one morning, about 3 months before the trip, that I should, for no particular reason, try learning as much Turkish as I could in the time I had, just to see how much I could actually accomplish. I had mixed success, but I kept on with it even after I got back home, and I'm still steadily learning it to this day. But in studying Turkish, I was exposed to linguistic features and structures I never would have thought possible. Things like agglutination, negative conjugations, question auxiliaries, and evidentiality. This totally revolutionized my view of how language could work. So naturally, I decided to take all the new features I'd seen in Turkish and include them in my language as well. As I continued learning Turkish, I started developing interest in other languages, Greek, Finnish, Mandarin, and Classical Nahuatl, to name a few. And all the new grammatical concepts I came across were copied wholesale into my burgeoning language. And as I did this, I found more and more satisfaction in developing the language further, to the point of neglecting all the other elements of the world I was creating. My language was no longer just a small facet of the world-building process, it became a hobby independent of the project it was part of. I would spend hours ravenously looking through Wikipedia pages for new elements of grammar, and every time I came across something I'd never seen before, I said to myself, well, I gotta put this in there too. Even if it made absolutely no sense with how the language worked already. Oh, what's this? Switch reference? That's neat, I'll throw that in as well, even though I already have multiple systems of referent tracking. And what's that? Some languages distinguish alienable and inalienable possession? Well, I'm going to use that too, even though I've already got 3 different ways of marking possession. And this went on, and on, and on, until eventually the language became so bloated and unwieldy, Such a patchwork monstrosity crammed with as many features as I could possibly squeeze in, most of which I didn't even fully understand, that it became impossible to keep track of which strategy to use in which instances, and even very simple sentences became difficult to translate. Until finally, I had to take a step back and see my beloved creation for what it had become. Utter trash. And after investing a year's worth of work into it, I was forced to consign Thandian to an isolated corner of my conlanging folder, where it has festered ever since. Until today. So, let's take a closer look and dissect the hulking corpse of this linguistic abomination to see what went so horribly wrong. Oh boy, what have I got myself into? Let's start with the, phonology, if you could even call it that. This is the consonant inventory of Thandian. Does that seem familiar to you at all? Here, maybe this will help. Yep, exactly the same as English. And the vowels aren't much better either, basically just English's vowel inventory with a bit less variation. This seems to have been one area where I was apparently very reticent to deviate from English. At the time, my understanding of phonology more or less boiled down to, there's all the sounds we have in English, and then there's a couple of other weird ones, but I don't want to include any of those because I don't want my language to be weird. And of course there was no allophonic variation of any kind, at least none that I defined explicitly, and there were no rules for defining syllable shapes or phonotactics. I didn't even know how the IPA worked at the time, so all that was well beyond me. I would have thought coming up with a bad romanization system for a language that has pretty much exactly the same phonetic inventory as English would be basically impossible, but somehow I managed it. Using E, I, and O for I, and O makes enough sense, as does using the schwa for but the good stuff ends there. A contrasts with R, so I decided to represent the former with an A, and the latter with a double A. And if there were ever any doubts that I'm a native English speaker, I decided to romanize oo and E with a double O and double E respectively. And as if that wasn't bad enough, I chose to represent the diphthongs A, I, and O with macrons. My god. But the worst part was actually in the consonants. Clearly I was influenced by Klingon's use of mixed case for its romanization, so I decided to use the same trick for any consonants that I didn't know how to romanize, which turned out to consist of exactly one sound, the voiced dental fricative tha. I wanted a way to differentiate it from the voiceless dental fricative, which English spelling doesn't, so I decided to romanize it with a capital TH. Yeah. Again, this was the only place where capital letters were used to distinguish sounds, so when looking at the language written down, you're immediately confronted with all the capital THs that stick out like a sore thumb, and it looks atrocious. What was I thinking? The only part of the language that at least kind of holds up is the script. It's got a fairly consistent aesthetic to it, and I went to the trouble of actually adding serifs to make it look like it was carved into stone, which is what I was going for. You can tell I was trying for a sort of featural script, where sounds with similar phonetic characteristics are represented with similar looking characters, except it's kind of hard to encode phonetic information in symbols when you have no idea how phonology works in the first place. So you can see that the sounds are grouped based on which corner the intersection occurs in, so top left is post-alveolar fricatives and affricates, top right is dental and alveolar fricatives, bottom left is alveolar and velar stops, and bottom right are labial stops and fricatives. Of course, I just made these groupings based on how similar I subjectively felt the sounds to be. I could have easily taken a quick glance at the IPA to get a clearer idea of how the sounds were related, but for some reason I just didn't care to do that. I was far more concerned with expanding the grammar. And speaking of the grammar, that's where things get even worse. After all the innumerable additions I pulled from every language I could find resources for, this is how the grammar ended up. Yep, a list of stems on one side, and a list of affixes on the other. Of course, it was all perfectly regular and entirely consistent, and didn't have any features that I deemed as irrational. like grammatical gender or any form of agreement. But damned if it didn't have everything else under the sun. Thandian has 6 grammatical numbers: singular, dual, paucal, plural, distributive, and collective, and these were marked on both nouns and verbs. The verbal affixes include markers for the subject and object, and the object markers can also be used for indirect objects and, I guess, other roles if you really wanted to. But all those same roles are also marked on nouns via case marking, so there's a whole lot of double marking going on. Nouns are marked for one of 15 cases. I remember seeing Finnish's grammar for the first time and being blown away by the sheer number of cases it had. Latin's case system, the only one I'd known until that point and the one that I had copied one for one, was minuscule by comparison, so, not to be outdone, I decided I needed to have at least as many noun cases as Finnish. It's a good thing I didn't know about says at the time, for the sake of my own sanity. The cases include 2 separate genitives, one for alienable possession and one for inalienable possession, a case specifically to mark the topic and comment of a copula, and 2 opposing trios of cases, one for discussing position and motion in space, and the other for position and motion in time. This disentangling of time and space is actually quite a persistent feature across the whole language. Like for every adjective to do with dimensionality, there are 2 separate roots, one for space and one for time, which seemed like a good idea when I first came up with it, because they're 2 different concepts, and therefore they should get 2 different words. Which would be fine, and in fact even kind of interesting for an Auxlang or Engelang, but not for a naturalistic language. I'm not sure if a natural language has ever even existed that doesn't describe temporal relationships in terms of spatial ones. And there's a bunch of things like that that just come across as artificial, like how there's 3 different words for good, one that means morally good, one that means well or favourable, and one that means adept or skillful. Now, this isn't necessarily unnaturalistic, and could be an interesting feature if there was actual etymology behind these words and how they came to coexist. But here it just feels so forced and inorganic. I was clearly putting these differences in just because I felt obligated to create as many distinctions as possible. Along those same lines, when I first made the verb system, the past tenses consisted of the perfect, the imperfect, and the pluperfect, ported over exactly as they were in Latin. But then I realized I didn't know whether to use the perfect or the imperfect to translate past simple sentences in English, so I made a separate past simple tense to cope with that. And then I realized I had no way of handling past perfect continuous sentences, so I made a new aspect for that. And then I learned about languages that have tenses that distinguish between the near past and the far past, so then I had to make those tenses as well, and the simple, completed, and continuous aspects could be applied to all of those too. Again, it's not necessarily unnaturalistic to have a language with all of these different tenses, but I clearly wasn't thinking about things in terms of their evolution or usage. I was just shoehorning in as many affixes as I possibly could, just for the sake of it. The derivational affixes are remarkably Englishy, with many of them being labelled in terms of their English equivalents. There's a nominalizing suffix that's supposed to mean the same thing as the ness suffix in English, so turning adjectives into nouns. But there's another suffix that's supposed to mean the same thing as the tude suffix, and another for the ity suffix, even though all 3 of these basically do the same thing in English, and the only reason we have them all is because of various historical shenanigans. And looking at these notes now, I have no idea whether any of these suffixes can be applied to any adjective, or if a given adjective can only take one of the 3. Speaking of adjectives, they might be the most embarrassing element in all of this. For my countless hours spent poring over Wikipedia, the only thing I learned about adjectives beyond the basics was that they sometimes agree in case and number with the nouns they modify, which I knew I didn't want to do because that was, in my mind, irrational. But I felt like I had to have some sort of special morphology for them, so I did a Google search and found a PowerPoint from a middle school English class that claimed there were 4 different types of adjectives: descriptive, resultant, limiting, and verbal. so I just made an affix for each of those. And, likewise, adverbs are classified as either adverbs of time, space, manner, degree, or frequency, all of which get their own affixes. Oh, dear God, that is painful. And by the way, the verbal adjective is apparently different from the participle, which is also different from the gerundive, and I couldn't tell you for the life of me what the difference is supposed to be. All of these decisions were simply motivated by my insatiable compulsion to throw in as much morphology as I could, the end result of which was essentially a poor man's version of Ithquil if it was made by someone who had no idea how language works, who simultaneously insisted that it was all perfectly naturalistic. So, what can we take away from this? Number 1, always keep your goals in mind. Whenever you set out to make a new conlang, it's critically important to establish your goals from the very beginning and let them dictate every decision you make. The only objective measure of how good or bad a conlang is how well it fulfills its stated goals. If your goal is to make a naturalistic language, like mine supposedly was, then your number 1 priority should be to ensure that everything you put in the language could plausibly occur in a natural language. This was my first mistake. Thandian was supposed to be a naturalistic language, spoken by a fictional population of native speakers, but I didn't actually do anything to make the language appear naturalistic, and indeed did things that made it unnaturalistic. I assumed everything I was doing was automatically naturalistic because I was copying all of these features from natural languages, but that doesn't make a feature naturalistic in and of itself. For example, when I learned in Latin the suffix que conveyed the same meaning as the English word and, that was all the justification I needed to make a whole series of conjunctive affixes. After all, Latin does it, so why can't I? But what I didn't know was that the Latin que suffix was just the result of a separate word being spoken in the same breath as the noun it goes with, which isn't too different from what sometimes happens in English. Knowing this, my conjunctive affixes now look entirely nonsensical. As you might expect, the best way to combat things like this is to learn as much as you can about how natural languages work. Not just what their features are, but how those features come to be. Number 2, in the words of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, a designer knows he has achieved perfection not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. This is actually a common pitfall of many beginning conlangers, sometimes called a Frankenlang, where one throws in everything they know about language into one hideous amalgamation, and this is exactly the trap that I fell for. I was under the impression that putting more structures and features into the language would make it more interesting, but that's really not the case. In fact, you can actually make a conlang more interesting by omission. For instance, what if, when making your language, you decide that verbs aren't going to have a morphological future tense? How will the language cope with future statements? Maybe it uses an auxiliary verb, maybe it just uses time phrases and adverbs, or maybe some combination of particles. Any of these strategies would be much more interesting than just making another affix out of the blue. For every feature you introduce, always consider how it interacts with what you've already created. And when encoding grammar, try seeing if you can find a way to convey the meaning with what you've already got before creating something brand new. And number 3, practice makes perfect. Just like learning any new skill, when you first get into conlanging, you're more than likely going to struggle, but don't let that discourage you. It's pretty much inevitable that you'll eventually have to seriously overhaul or even completely scrap a project that you've invested a lot of effort into. But it's not a waste of time, because you'll have learned what to do differently for the next project. After I realized how terrible Thandian was, I started a new language, one where this time I was a lot more selective in what I decided to include. I knew from the outset that I wanted it to be as naturalistic as possible, and so I included things like irregularity, multiple paradigms for nouns and verbs, and a gender system. And it also sucked, but it was definitely a major improvement. So I made another language, and then another, and another, and with every new project I got slightly less terrible. Even today, while I have 4 or 5 languages that I'm pretty satisfied with, I still have to go back and make revisions periodically. It's a long, long learning process, but if you stick with it, you'll ultimately reach a level where all the innumerable facets and decisions that once seemed so daunting become second nature to you. So, beyond any of the technical details, these are perhaps the 3 most important adages for any conlanger to live by. Unfortunately for me, I had to learn them the hard way, but hopefully you're now better equipped to do what I could not. So go forth then, and conlang. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to do something I should have done a long, long time ago.